The forge smelled of oil and iron and the peculiar sharp sweetness of hot steel. Night presses weighed on the building, roof trusses dark against a sky that had long since forgotten sunlight. But inside the plant, the air swam with a heat that made the mind small and the work immediate. Sparks struck like transient stars over the belt conveyors, and the steady, low thump of the press kept the hours measured. A metronome set to the tempo of a nation at work. Walter Brackett stood with his forearms braced on the railing above the retooled assembly line. The rim of his cap darkened with soot, and watched the tractor frames move through stages that no one on the day shift could have imagined for them a year before. Where green tractors once rolled out to feed farms, plates of armor now came down the line, welded and chamfered into an object built for a different kind of ground. If you like the kind of story that excavates the machines as much as the people who make them, if you want to see how steel learns to be resilient, stay with this one to the end and consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss the whole arc of how craft met demand here in the wartime years. Brackett's hands remembered tools the same way a musician remembers fingers. He had been a metallurgist before the plant pivoted. He had read microstructures the way others read newspapers. He could tell by sound when a forge was running too hot, by the pattern of a fracture where a weld had failed. Tonight, the problem lay not in a single joint, but in an expectation. The tractor factory's presses and jigs had been designed for long, forgiving loads. A tank needed concentrated resistance, a resilience against strikes and concussive shock that tractor frames had never been built to bear. Armor plates that showed promise under tensile tests would shatter its spot welds when a gun's concussion found their weakness. "How long until they stop spitting cracks?" Tommy Reyes asked from below, his voice carrying up as the line swallowed words. He was 20, fingers darkening with grease, the kind of young mechanic who stitched his anxieties into overtime shifts. His brother had been shipped out to England the month before. The letter, folded in the breast pocket of his coveralls, smelled faintly of smoke. "Until the steels taught a new lesson," Brackett said. He did not mean to sound poetic. The metaphor sat at the edge of everything they did. The idea that metal, like a patient animal, could be trained by heat and hammer into endurance. We stop forcing it to be what it was for, and we make it what it needs to be. They tried carburizing, high-carbon skins welded to lower-carbon backing to give the plates a hard, impact-resistant face while keeping a ductile core. They tried austenitizing cycles timed to the second. They sent samples to the lab for optical microscopy, watched the etched grains reveal themselves like a landscape. The problem kept recurring along weld seams, in the fillets that tied turret rings to hulls. The work was less dramatic than the headlines, but no less urgent. A seam fails at a certain recoil angle, a shot finds a stress riser, and a crew's day ends in rubble. The plant's orders were measured in dozens of chassis per day. The Army wanted machines in the field and wanted them yesterday. "Why does it break here?" Tommy would ask, and Brackett would crouch, hands by the fracture, smelling for the residue of flux or contamination. Once, he found that a mill operator had slapped the wrong anti-scaling compound onto a batch of plates. Sulfur contamination at parts per million had made the steel brittle when quenched. Once, a welder's torch had run too hot during a long run, drawing carbon to the seam and creating a hard, glassy line that crumbled under violent stress. Each failure had a human root: exhaustion, inattention, the pressing orders that made repair cheaper than proper prevention. Behind Brackett, the line carried on in a tide. Women in bandanas, red the favored defiant color, moved with a dignity of motion learned from hours of repetition. They turned shafts, bolted traversing gears, inspected castings with a mix of mechanical exactness and superstition. A woman with a freckled nose and a laugh that came out in small tea-break bursts would tap a cooling turret and call it her baby before it went into storage. The plant was a congregation of people who did not pray much. Their sacrifices were measured in calloused palms, in missed dinners, in an intimacy with heat and metal that made them feel like guardians of a secret. At a press bench farther down, Colonel Hartley of the Ordnance Branch paced in a way that made the welders quiet. He carried with him the type of urgency that sits on a man's shoulders like extra weight. Letters from the theater arrived in Hartley's satchel, reports of crews praising the rigs that held up under fire, and reports that made the mouth dry. Turret rings fractured under direct hits. Transmissions failed under continuous operation. Crews pinned between the jostle of tracks and the skin of a penetrating shell. The military sent figures. The War Department sent timetables. The plant had been promised a fill-up of machinery and trained machinists if throughput could be elevated. Requests came as numbers: more turrets, more gearboxes, more schedules to be met. Brackett answered with metallurgy. He revised the heat treatment schedule so a lower quench rate allowed the plate cores to retain ductility, while surface hardening created a skin that better deflected shrapnel. He pushed for the adoption of a chrome moly alloy for critical components, crankcases, and final drives, an alloy that, with the right temper, could endure the shock of sudden torque without catastrophic failure. He wrote long, exacting memos that read like love letters to steel. The grain must be coaxed, he wrote once, not driven into shape. We ask the metal to do violent things. We owe it controlled instruction. Engineers and machinists argued into the early hours. They learned to listen to the machines in a different register. A gearbox that hummed steadily under a 500-horse test load would announce its fate in a way that let a trained ear save it. A sharp note at 3,000 rotations per minute that flickered like a needle on a gauge. A telltale vibration from a bearing that presaged the slow, hungry failure that would mean a stranded tank on a cold field. They built contraptions on the shop floor. A cage for torsional testing. An improvised oil cooler run from a surplus radiator, a cooling shroud to direct air to a stubborn heat zone. The craftsmanship was almost surgical in its improvisation. Between tests, the plant held small rituals. A test track ran through the yard, a short ribbon of packed earth where a tank could be run for an endurance loop. When a prototype came back with its gauges within thresholds, oil temp holding steady, differential not overheating, the crew would let out a sound that was not quite cheer and not quite relief. Brackett would stand a little apart, eyes on the skid marks and on the belched steam rising from the engine. The tank's engine was called a heartbeat more often than not. Pilots in the air had used the same figure for their plane's motors. Here, the metaphor took on an added weight. A heart that could be trusted in motion, under stress, without the small mistakes that turned a crew's day into catastrophe. But every beat carried consequence. Reports from across the ocean changed the mood in the mess hall. Men who had helped shape a casting would sit with a fork paused mid-air, and the radio at the back wall would crackle out accounts of burnt towns and displaced families. The plant had a comment to make in the world. These tanks would carry men into places scarred by bombing, into streets where civilians sometimes stood with their belongings, eyes hollow and hands clutching. Brackett found himself at dinner thinking of a turret welded to a hull somewhere in the line, and then thinking of a house flattened by a shell. He told no one exactly how he felt. His face was suited for the chemistry lab, impassive, but inside a quiet unease set like a slow varnish. The moral pressure did not stop the machine of production, but it bent conversations in the corners. A machinist named Hank, short, with a laugh like a loose gear, said one evening while oiling a set of sprockets, "We make it to keep our boys alive, Walt." He meant that the better the reliability, the fewer crews would be stranded and exposed to worse threats. Brackett nodded. The calculus was not simple. The plant's work protected lives in one measure and enabled destruction in another. The thought tightened his chest, a human reaction to the ambiguity of his craft. Failures escalated with the seasons. In March, and again in the heat of July, a wave of cracked final drives came in from testing. Teams were dispatched down to the foundry to check pore temperatures and gating systems. A late addition of alloying element to address one failure introduced a sensitivity in another. They ran metallurgical scans, etched micrographs under gleaming lenses, and found strata that told stories of uneven cooling and trapped porosity. The craftsmen on the floor learned a new vocabulary: tempering bands, decarburized skins, retained austenite. Each term held a consequence and a prescription. There were human costs beyond the moral ones. In an afternoon when the plant was under pressure to make up a backlog, a press operator's hand was caught in a jaw that had been misaligned by a night worker's incorrect shim. The injury was sudden and ugly in its outcome, though was described in the plant bulletin with measured restraint. A partial amputation of 2 fingers, a long recovery expected. In the infirmary, the man's wife sat with an embroidery pattern in her lap and would not look at the cast. The tone in the factory shifted that week. Men handled parts with a chillier respect, a reminder that the work's hazards were intimate. Brackett visited quietly, brought a note and a new pair of gloves for the man's forearm, and left before the family had to talk about insurance or extended unpaid labor. The sort of late, small mercies that did not much ease the wound, but offered a human recognition. They had moments of ingenuity that read like small miracles. A weld seam that refused to hold under recoil was redesigned with a double join. A mechanical interlock cut into the mating faces. The weld then applied to seal rather than carry the entire moment. It meant one more operation on the line, one more jig, but it saved whole crews' lives. A makeshift oil cooler borrowed from a surplus truck radiator, bolted to the belly of the transmission, cut peak temps enough to prevent oil breakdown during long runs. A machinist named Elsie discovered that a household enamel she used as a solvent for bearings cleaned in a way that shop solvents did not. Someone scavenged the formula and coded it into the next batch's work instructions. The inventions were not grandiose. They were exacting, domestic, and stubborn. They were proof that skill could mitigate brute force. The breakthrough came in a run that the plant's foremen had not promised themselves they'd see. It had been months of incremental victories. A plate that took a new quench without warping. A gear that survived a simulated field cycle. A turret that held its ring under direct recoil. On a wet autumn morning, a prototype, nose and hull armored, turret latched, track snug, rolled on to the test track. The crew strapped instruments to it, thermocouples under the gearbox housing, tachometers on the clutch, oil pressure gauges brazenly taped to the dashboard. Men and women came home from shifts with the pride of having shaped history in small, tangible increments. The first shipment left for the European theater in late 1943. Brackett went to the rail yard that morning, sleeves rolled, hands folded behind his back. He watched the flat cars like a man at a funeral whose feelings were too complex to voice. The tanks looked smaller when seen in lines. The levity of their curves belied the purposes they would serve. A sergeant came up and clapped Brackett on the shoulder, a rough and human gesture that steadied something like resolve. "We did good work, sir," the sergeant said, eyes on the tanks. He had been to training camps and spoke of men who trusted their machines more than they sometimes trusted orders. Brackett nodded. He thought of the foreman who'd lost fingers and how the plant had paid for a week's recovery and the rest would come. He thought of Tommy's brother in England. He thought of steel tempered by patient cycles. Reports returned, and they were not uniform. There were dispatches of reliability, a story of a convoy that survived shelling because a transmission held. And there were reports of the broader devastations of ground war, towns reduced to rubble, civilians displaced, the dry ache of winter in a war-torn place. Brackett kept these accounts, one hand holding a wrench, the other holding a map. The plant's workers had asked for better machines to protect the men who rode them. In that most immediate metric, they had succeeded. But the wider effects of war pressed inward like a cold draft through a cracked window. As the war shifted into its final furious year, another current began to whisper through the plant. What machines would come after this? Men spoke of post-war tractors again, of farms needing rebuilding, of the industries that would pivot back to peace. Brackett liked to imagine a future where the presses returned to making implements for fields rather than for battle. He imagined a red bandana woman tapping a plowshare into place and smiling without the ambiguous weight of a metal's past. The thought comforted him, but did not solve the arithmetic of loss. When the guns quieted in 1945 and the plant's tempo slowed, a new silence entered the building like an afterimage. The line that had once hummed at a fever pitch moved down to a steadier beat. Men and women who had been on double shifts found their workdays shortened. Some left, hips and hands bearing scars that employment could not erase. Others stayed and learned to make parts for the peacetime market. Tanks that remained were crated and sent to depots or museums. Brackett walked the empty assembly bays one evening, a businesslike figure under the high windows where dust motes swam like slow, weightless snow. He ran his palm along a turret ring and felt the temperature of the steel the way he used to feel a patient's pulse. The memory of the plant's heat stayed with him, tattooed in the way he walked, how he rested his hands. In a small room off the main floor, a framed photograph was mounted on the wall, a group portrait, grease-smudged faces arranged around a finished tank, smiles stiff with the pride of survival and duty. No caption tried to make the moral calculus simple. Brackett looked at that photograph and then at the machines that remained in the yard, and he thought of a phrase he had used in a report earlier in the war. "We instruct the metal." It read now as both description and confession. The metal had been instructed to endure. Men and women had instructed it. They had built something that could shelter a crew, claw through a battlefield, and, sometimes, be an instrument of a terrible necessity. Years later, when veterans came back through the plant for tours, they touched the worn railings and spoke in low voices about how these tanks had been like hearts in the cold. Brackett, older now, would stand beside them and listen. A flight engineer, no, a tank commander, once kissed the steel of a hull as if blessing it. He told a boy accompanying him that a machine that held together was like a promise kept. Brackett accepted the compliment with the studied modesty of men who had seen both sides of their work. He had felt the pride and the ache. He had been at the anvil where necessity met craft. The factory eventually quieted for good as new technologies came. Engines with different rhythms, designs that no longer needed the painstaking tempering that had been the proud language of Brackett's shop. The site's buildings were repurposed, then parceled, then a museum plaque put up to note that here once lay the place that had reshaped tractors into armored vehicles. The plaque was measured. It did not attempt to comfort or to condemn. It simply listed dates and numbers and the names of those who had been recognized. Brackett read it and felt both honored and unsettled. On the last day he came to the now museum floor, clean swept, pristine glass cases where once men had sweated. He traced the outline of a worn torque wrench in a display and thought of rhythm. Heat and heart, creation and consequence. The plant had been a crucible in which metal and will were forged together. The heartbeat that the machines made had saved lives and, in other measures, inflicted pain. That ambiguity would sit in history the way rust settles, slowly, inevitably, a mark of time and use. He left the building under a winter sky that had the clarity of old photographs. The hum of production that had once been a kind of church bell receded into silence. For a while he walked along the yard fence, listening for ghosts. The echo of a press, the laugh of a woman with a freckled nose, the soft cadence of a tank engine being coaxed into a steady rhythm on the test track. In his pocket, he carried a small, rough note from Tommy's brother, who had come back to teach at a university, who wrote simply that better machines had meant fewer nights under fire, and that gratitude was complicated. Brackett folded the paper and slid it back in. The story of this plant was not a single line of glory. It was many small ones braided together, the stubborn experiments with heat and alloy, the nights spent on cots beside a glowing forge, the injuries and the small mercies at the infirmary, the faces in the group photograph, the shipments that left by rail and turned up in dispatches, the letters that asked whether the men had any regret. Brackett held his own answer in a private place. He had loved the work for its exactness. He had been proud of the endurance they taught the metal. He had been haunted by the uses to which that endurance was put. Outside, a new generation rolled tractors past the plant gates toward farms that needed rebuilding. Somewhere, a child on a hillside watched a tractor slope into a field and thought of nothing but plowed earth. Brackett watched them go and felt a shape of hope, that the skill and care honed under the pressure of war might, in time, be rechanneled to make small, life-giving things for communities instead of engines for conflict. The memory of the heat would stay with all of them, the sound of a press, the smell of scale and soot, but so would the memory of hands that had refused to be hurried in a work that asked more than it gave. They had instructed the metal, and in doing so had left behind a lesson. Technology's power is ambivalent. It is a steward for those who wield it rightly, a peril for those who do not. The plant's legacy would be both, the hum of an engine and the pause afterward, the beat and the silence it could bring. The lights in the museum dimmed as Brackett left. He placed his palm for a moment on the cool railing and imagined, briefly, a field where machines turned only to the needs of lives that were not under threat. Then he walked away into the cold, carrying the steady, complicated pride that belongs to those who craft things strong enough to endure. He walked the short distance to the house he had kept since the war, and that had grown both smaller and more honest with age. The door gave with a familiar protest. Inside, the rooms were spare, arranged against the slow economy of a single life. A kettle sat on the stove, a folded newspaper on the table, his spectacles in the same place they had always been placed when not in use, on a small wooden box that had once held calipers. Brackett set his palm on the back of a chair, as if to steady himself against a particular upset of memory, then bent to undo the latch of the kettle and let the house fill with the thin, domestic steam of mundane heat. He unwrapped Tommy's brother's note again, because the act of touching the paper steadied thought in the way that handling a familiar tool steadied the hand. The handwriting was neat and unhurried, a professor's script rather than the shorthand of the field. Better machines, he had written. Fewer nights under fire. Gratitude complicated. The sentence sat like a hinge that could open in more than one direction. Brackett read it through slowly, as though testing whether the letters were made of the same metal he had tempered for so many years. Outside, the tractors rumbled along, their new engines thrumming with a different pitch, less raw, more smooth. He could have watched them for an hour, he thought, but the field of watching had diminished for him. He had watched enough engines come and go. Instead, he made tea and set the newspaper aside, and found, beneath the advertisements, a small column about an upcoming gathering to mark the 50th anniversary of the plant's founding. Names would be read. Plaques would be turned to face the sun. A handful of old men might speak. There was a photograph of the original workforce, faces weathered and bright and young at once. He knew every face in that photograph. He could name them without thinking. He did not cross the photograph with his finger. He had done that already, in his head, for years. The day he finally left the house, it was because his neighbor, Mrs. Halley, leaned over the fence and asked him to look at a problem with a plowshare that would not seat properly. She had a granddaughter now,
thin as a reed, hands quick with curiosity, who had been accepted to a technical program in the county. "Could you come by, Mr. Brackett?" Mrs. Halley said, as though his name were a tool she might borrow for an afternoon. He agreed, because even the smallest summons of the skilled felt like a summons to usefulness, and usefulness, after the weathering of the years, was its own kind of grace. The plowshare was dull from too many winters, and galled at the edges where rock had bitten. He sat on a low stool beside the workbench in Mrs. Halley's lean-to, and took the piece into his lap. The metal was cold. It had been shaped by work that sought to make the soil yield, and Brackett liked that purpose. He set the share beneath his palm and imagined for a moment the other uses that metal had seen. The hand that held the file moved with a memory that belonged to the press and the forge, and as he rasped the edge, he felt the same discipline of patience. Remove no more than is necessary. Test the fit. Return to the bench. 2 children from the neighborhood came by to see what the old man was doing, and one of them, eyes bright, reached out to touch the warmed edge when Brackett had returned it to the sun. He smiled then, and it was a small, private beginning of repair. Word of his willingness to help had spread. The next week a letter came from a woman named Claire who ran a workshop in the next town.
She wrote that a collective of young mechanics and farmers were trying to convert old vehicles into multi-purpose machines for recovering farms, and that they were short on the kind of hands-on knowledge that could make a design last. Would he, she asked, be willing to visit, to look at plans, to talk about the tempering of joints and the reality of fatigue? There was no flattery in her tone. Instead, there was a practical hunger. Brackett folded the letter and set it where he could find it in the dark. In the morning, he found himself accepting the invitation. He rode the county bus across the strip of flat country where the winters dug their furrows in the road. The bus smelled faintly of oil and leather and the last passenger's cologne. As the towns passed, he watched rows of newly planted trees and houses with laundry lines where shirts flapped like small flags. He had never been eager for travel, but the movement soothed some bone-deep restlessness. When he arrived at Claire's workshop, it did not look like a relic or a monument, but rather like a place that was still in negotiation with itself. Tarpaulins here, salvaged frames there, a half-assembled turnip harvester leaning against a wall like an unfinished promise. The group that met him was younger than he expected and older than he had wished. They had the impatient hands of apprentices, the solemn faces of those who had not yet learned where the pride ought to sit, and an earnestness he could not deny. Claire was authoritative without the loudness of command. She wore a sweater with grease at the cuff and a smile that translated negotiation into work. There was also a man named Ellis with a voice like a worn axe who introduced himself as a former driver and who had been wounded in the later campaigns. His left hand had a tremor that arrived when he was tired. "Mr. Brackett," Claire said, "we do most of our modifying for tractors and harvesters. But we have an idea, something to help when the weather turns and when supply chains fail. We thought perhaps people with your history could help us make things that don't fall apart." Brackett listened. They showed him sketches, frames that could be adapted, axles that could be reinforced, couplings meant to be simple to maintain in the field. The drawings had the urgency of need rather than the cold precision of production lines. They needed a tempering that would not demand a foundry, solutions that could be executed with a small forge, with a mind toward repair by someone without Brackett's years. They wanted longevity without the excess of heavy engineering, elegance without the pretense. It pleased him. He found himself staying longer than he had planned. He liked the way the young people argued, fast and candid, sometimes clumsy, sometimes wise in small ways. At a bench near the window, he taught 2 of them how to file a bevel so that it would not chip. Ellis sat nearby, telling stories about nights on the road that were never traced wholly in the dispatches. The stories were raw in pieces. Laughter at a stopped engine up to a clustered village fire. The abrupt silence when a convoy did not arrive. The slow, absurd mercy of a cup of tea given in a dark church hall. When Ellis spoke about the tremor in his hand, he did so without complaint. He was more interested in how to weld a bracket that could take uneven loading. At dusk, he walked back to his boarding place with a small parcel under his arm, the beginnings of a coupling flange he had agreed to test. The night felt close in, and he felt older in the particular way that comes when one returns to bed earlier than one would have liked. He heard, as he always did in the quiet, the echo of a press, a single, measured beat that had once been ordered like a hymn. The echo had no moral weight in itself. It was simply a timing. What mattered, he thought, was how it was used. The invitation to speak at the anniversary gathering reached him in a thick envelope. The committee wanted him to say a few words about the plant's early days. Brackett hesitated. He could have declined, have let others shape the memory, but he felt pulled by a different consideration, the chance to name things honestly in public, to give cause for both pride and sorrow in one breath. He accepted, with the stipulation that he would not allow the speech to become laudatory to a point that erased the other facts. The day of the anniversary was bright. Flags were at half-mast, and yet, somehow, the air was anticipatory rather than mournful. People gathered, men in caps who had been photographed in their youth at the gates, women with small purses and larger patience, children who had never seen a pressed steel plate and marveled at its heft. The photograph that had been on the invitation, of the men in front of the original press, hung near the speaker stand. Brackett walked out to it and placed his hand at the lower corner, like the touch of a craftsman inspecting a finished piece. Speaking was for him an exercise in the correct application of pressure. He did not want to sentimentalize. He did not want either to descend into apology. He spoke of the forge and the feel of the steel against the gloved hand. He spoke of the smell of scale and the small sounds that marked a day's work. He spoke, carefully, of the nights of repair when they had patched engines by the light of hurricane lamps, and of the letters that arrived from the other side of the sea, their thanks folded like brittle paper. Then he said what had been private, that every hammer's fall had been both saving and severing, that the machines had kept lives and also kept the possibility of loss moving with new efficiency. A murmur went through the crowd. A man near the back, whose face was set in the hard geometry men learned from service, began to speak out, not with anger, but with the blunt authority of grief. "We lost sons," he said, and it landed like a stone. "Machines don't pick up the dead. Machines carry men to where gunfire waits." Brackett let the statement rest. He understood the texture of grief. He had held it own hands before. "No," he said finally, "and they never will. They are tools. Whether they are used to plow a field or to move a machine into a position that causes harm depends on how hands hold them." He did not say more. There was a complexity in which the words "it depends" lived like an open seam. Some in the crowd nodded. Some had their faces fixed. A woman pressed a small photograph into the hand of the man who had spoken. Her son, young and smiling, and he held it against his heart. After the formal remembrances, people drifted toward the museum glass like a tide. They spoke in small groups, and Brackett found himself beside Claire and Ellis, who were arguing quietly about a flange design. "We're trying to make things fixable," Claire said, "not necessarily less powerful, just less inscrutable. If it breaks on a farmhouse road, you ought to be able to get it working by the time the milk spoils." Ellis chuckled. "And if it comes under fire, better in the hand of someone who knows the face of repair." Brackett felt his face relax. "That's what I taught," he said. "Make it so a farmer can mend it with a file. Make it so a neighbor's child can lift the manual." They walked afterward to the small cafe on the edge of town, where the paint peeled and the coffee was honest. Over cups, Ellis told more about the roads and the odd acts of kindness that had stitched the maps of their lives. Men sharing rations with strangers, a woman giving bandages to a passerby. He also told of places where machinery had been used with a kind of indifference that made the hair on his neck stand up. Tools answer the questions we ask them, he said. They don't ask the rest. They're obedient. It was getting late when Brackett stepped out into air that held the first breath of thaw. He had an envelope from the museum in his pocket. Inside it lay a small card noting a gift in his name to the Restoration Fund, something the board had arranged without his knowledge. He realized, standing under the street lamp, that there were people who wished to honor the work without counting the cost. That, too, was a kind of gratitude, simpler perhaps, but not without meaning. At home, he placed the card among his papers and turned out the light. He lay awake for a while, listening to the house's small mechanical protests, thinking of the apprentices he had worked with, and of the men in the photograph who had laughed before the harnessing of the machines taught them other languages. He thought of Tommy and the strange network of loss and learning that tied a shop floor to a battlefield to a family table.
When he finally slept, it was not the untroubled sleep of forgetfulness, but a weary one, threaded with images of sparks that flew like small, bright birds. Days later, a message arrived from an institution he had never imagined would take an interest. The technical college where Tommy's brother taught had proposed a commemorative scholarship for students of applied mechanics. They asked him to be on the advisory panel. The idea made him uneasy for reasons he could not immediately name. Was he to bless the future work of young hands without insisting on a certain moral attention? And yet he accepted. He thought it would be a place from which he could ask the difficult questions. Not simply how to make things that last, but how to teach people to ask of their work what it would cost to be done. At the first meeting in the college's workshop, a space filled with roar and the smell of lubricant, Brackett found himself surrounded by younger instructors who spoke of curricula with the sober faith of planners. They asked about fatigue and yield points and the ways in which tempering could change under different quenching media. He spoke, and sometimes he used words that made the younger men frown in that practical way one does when an old man brings up the moral anatomy of a machine. We must teach them to temper their judgment as well as their steel, he said. Teach them to build what can be fed in a crisis, to simplify repairs, to make maintainability a prime requirement. Someone in the back, a lecturer with a steady voice, asked him whether it was possible to legislate such morals into an engineering curriculum. Brackett smiled at the absurdity of law over steel. You don't legislate care, he said, you train it. You set up a rhythm of practice where the default is repair, where everyone knows how to take a cover off and find a broken bolt. You make the first choice the one that turns toward life. Outside, late winter light had started to betray the edges of spring. The snow along the hedges had receded into fields of wet grass. Brackett found, in the steady days that followed, that his life had arranged itself around small acts of apprenticeship and occasional public speeches. He taught a woman how to shape a hinge. He listened as a young man described the project he hoped would turn several retired tractors into soup kitchens and mobile clinics in the North Towns. He argued with a committee about whether a manual should be written with the assumption that a farmer might not have an electric grinder. He found, to his surprise, that the bread of these days, routine, patient, incremental, was not a betrayal of the plant's intensity, but a continuation of its best feature, the insistence that a piece be right for its purpose. There remained always the question posed by the man at the memorial, the cost exacted by the instruments they had learned to make. Brackett did not pretend to dissolve that cost with contrition or to balance it with proud statistics. He lived, rather, in the practice of making decisions that considered the next hand that would hold the tool.
He argued for simplicity not because he was nostalgic for the past, but because simplicity, in his experience, often meant durability and repairability, and, therefore, fewer tragedies born of neglect. On a morning when the air had the clear bite of early spring, he received an unexpected visitor. It was the son of a man who had once worked at the plant and had been killed overseas. The son had been a child in the photograph on the wall, small and solemn, holding a cap. He had grown into a man who did not look for blame so much as for an account. He carried himself as one who had tried to learn from grief rather than be consumed by it. "Mr. Brackett," he said, when they sat at the small table, "my father used to speak of the tempering bench like a confessional. He said work kept him honest. He also used to say people sometimes forget to ask what a tool's design allows. I'm not here to make you carry his death. I'm here because I'm making something small and I want it to be done right. He told me I should learn from you." The son's voice was even. It surprised Brackett how much he wanted the man's approval, not for absolution, but as a witness. "There'll be no absolution in what we make," Brackett said, "unless we make it such that a neighbor can fix it and a child can understand it. If you want me to look over what you're building, I'll help." He found his thumb rubbing lightly over the corner of the napkin as though the action smoothed a seam within himself. They went out to the yard together where the son showed him his project. A small trailer fitted to move supplies between villages, braced to carry both weight and the indignities of muddy roads. It was not an instrument of war, but an instrument of bearing. Brackett examined the welds and the fittings and asked questions about access and the choice of bolts. The young man answered with a steadiness that suggested grief had taught him a useful kind of attention. When Brackett finally nodded his assent, something like permission passed between them, not to forget, but to carry forward. On his way home that evening, Brackett found he no longer carried only memory and weight. He carried also a list of small improvements for the trailer, the faint outline of a scholarship program's curriculum, the idea for a manual written with repair instructions and clear diagrams. He felt not an erasure of the past, but a redirection. The presses would remain in photographs and in museum glass, their echo a part of history. But there were new rhythms forming, small forges in rural shops, a shared language for repair, a conviction that building could mean making life possible rather than merely more efficient at destruction. He slept better in those nights. And when an old dream came, a press striking in measured beats, he woke with the memory of the sound and a clearer sense of the choice that had always been his to make. Not the choice of whether machines are neutral, for they are not, but the choice of how his craft would lean in the world. In the mornings, he would go to the bench and hold a file, and with each measured stroke, feel the beat of a new rhythm forming. One that made space, intentionally, for the next hand to take hold. Weeks later, the workshop received a shipment, a stripped engine and a chassis that might have been destined for war in another life but had been reclaimed by a farmer's goodwill. When Brackett and the others wheeled it into the light, there was a silence like the moment before a ballast struck. He put his palms on the cold metal and, without thinking too deeply about past or future, began to check fittings and fasteners, to listen for the true, clean rhythm of fit. A young apprentice turned the wrench as he had shown him, and the sound it made when the bolt seated was, for a moment, simply right. Outside, the sky held the thin blue of early spring. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a tractor started, and its engine hummed out across the fields. Steady, purposeful, a new cadence that promised work to come. Brackett tightened one last clamp and stepped back, letting a small, private satisfaction settle in his chest. The work would go on, imperfect, human, necessary. He thought of the men in the photograph and of the men who had turned metal into shelter or into sorrow. He thought of Tommy's brother's brief, complicated phrase about gratitude. It had weight, he realized, because gratitude itself could not be simple when built on a foundation of both mercy and harm.
He wiped his hands on a rag, and then, feeling the old habit of precision, he set the rag on the bench in a fold kept for that purpose. The apprentice beside him looked up with wide eyes. "Will you teach me to temper?" the boy asked. Brackett considered. He remembered the forge, the way heat moved through metal, the particularities of quenching in oil or water, the risks and the small, exact rewards. He saw in the boy's face not just a future tradesman, but the possibility that the next generation might make different choices with the tools they were taught to use. "Yes," he said at last, "but not only that. You'll learn to ask why a thing should be made the way it is. You'll learn to leave room for the next hand." The apprentice grinned, the kind of grin that begins a line of apprenticeship that might, in years, become a photograph. Outside, the starting of the tractor threaded the air into a long, ordinary music. Brackett listened and felt the beat of his old life soften into a different tempo, one that held both memory and the means for more careful work to come.
He stepped back to the bench and picked up the file, and the day unfolded around the deliberate, steady sound of metal being made ready for use.